This morning we're going to be hearing Dr. Fred Johnson. This is the fourth session, excuse me, in his History of the Black Church. And the title of this session is Resurrecting Pharaoh, which is going to end up in a very, he calls it a malignant Jim Crow character. And we all know that Dr. Johnson has been teaching at Hope for 20 years. And some of his courses are American Civil War and African history. His hobbies are hiking early in the morning, sometimes with his dog, sometimes not. And he's also interested in everything political. So would you please welcome Fred Johnson, and he will speak to us on Resurrecting Pharaoh. Thank you.
Good morning, scholars of HASP. It is a pleasure to be with you one more time. This session, as Kit pointed out, to go over the section entitled Resurrecting Pharaoh. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's begin this way. We spent a lot of our time talking about the origins of the Black church, why the Black church had to be in America in the first place. And I mentioned to you all on the very first day, the very first session, that until we answer the question about why there had to be a Black church, it will be very difficult to understand the theology of the Black church, the traditions of the Black church, the customs of the Black church, the music of the Black church. In other words, you cannot understand anything about the inner workings of the Black church without first directly confronting the reason why there had to be a Black church, when after all, the person that I call my master, Jesus the Christ, said that there will be just one church. And in any version of the Bible that I've ever read, he did not go through and add an addendum that said there would be different types of churches, just one that he was at the head of and which human beings would inhabit. And yet in the United States, we have this creature called the Black church, not because of the master's desire, but because of practical human necessity, where human beings inside the United States determined that people who look differently from each other could not worship their same God together. So if we start this way, getting at the 20th century, let's move a little bit ahead of the timeline. In the 20th century, and particularly in that part of the 20th century that dealt with the stock market crash of October 24th, 1929. Recent memory tells us from the Great Recession of just a few years ago, right around 2000, between 2006 and 2010, or 2006 and 2012. If you recall the news headlines from that period, just a few short years ago, people were saying that it was the most cataclysmic economic event for the United States and then therefore for the world since the Great Depression. And anybody who knows about the Great Depression, who's read about it, who grew up during the Great Depression, has relatives that even survived the Great Depression, knows that that is one event that we should do all possible never to revisit. And yet, there it was. The Great Depression caused the United States to do a number of different things in response. And one of those things during the Roosevelt administration, this is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the left, one of the things that the Roosevelt administration did, and of the many things that it did in trying to pass legislation, what they call FDR's alphabet soup, things like the National Recovery Act, things like the Works Progress Administration, things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. All these different programs, some of which are still with us today, were passed by the government to basically essentially put people to work. We've been hearing in the news recently about the pandemic or the COVID relief bill, the one that's being debated in Congress right now for $1.9 billion. Well, similarly, these were relief bills that were funded by the government to put people to work. And as one aspect of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, bear with me as I read here. We see here that one of those things that coming out of the WPA was the Federal Writers Project, created in 1935 as part of the United States Work Progress Administration to provide employment for historians, teachers, writers, librarians, and other white-collar workers. Originally, the purpose of the project was to produce a series of sectional guidebooks under the name American Guide, focusing on the scenic historical, cultural, and economic resources of the United States. I want to go back and emphasize cultural, because so much of what I want to talk about this morning, at least for this segment of our presentation, deals with the cultural aspect of a United States that even by 1935, that generation that we're going to be speaking of was dying off pretty quickly. Eventually, new programs were developed and projects begun under the Federal Emergency Relief Administration were absorbed by the Writers Project. From its inception in 1935 through late 1939, the Federal Writers Project was directed by Henry Alsberg. One of the things that the people of the Federal Writers Project did, and at the time, these were people like C. Van Woodward, a young historian who would go on to have a tremendous impact upon historiography and what we know of Southern history. He's the one who wrote the book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, which pretty much revolutionized what historians had understood and how they interpreted the Jim Crow era, post-Civil War, early 20th century. But a number of historians who cut their teeth, so to speak, on their craft, and they went into the American hinterland. They went into the mountains of Kentucky, the mountains of Western Virginia, the mountains of West Virginia, the mountains in Western North Carolina. They went into the rural areas of East Texas to get all these people who were in their 80s, 90s, or 70s, 80s, and 90s, some people that had lived during or through the Civil War. These people are still walking around, and they're carrying with them these treasures of memories about that period of the 19th century. And these writers, these teachers, these historians sat down and interviewed them. A good number of the people who were interviewed were African Americans, former slaves, people who had been born before or during slavery, had lived during the worst part of slavery, had seen the Civil War come and go, and whose memories were still very much alive with the difficulties of that period, the injustices of that period, the challenges of that period, and all that went along with that period. I cannot begin to even imagine what it must have been like to have been born a slave, see the Civil War come, see freedom come, and then see Reconstruction come, and then see it all just blow away like so many leaves in the wind. So by the time you get to the 20th century, what you've got is a new form of slavery, or as Michelle Alexander said in her book, her book titled, A New Jim Crow, only to live through that all in one lifetime. But let me back up a couple. Just take a look at these people's faces. Their faces, their expressions tell the story of so much that they've seen, so much that they've endured. Their bodies have been beaten up by life. And the miracle, beyond the fact that they're still there, they're in their right mind. Somehow they have found a reason to go on. And you can just look at their faces and tell that there is nothing but persevering, undaunting strength in their faces. They have seen the worst of what humanity in America could throw at them, and they came through it. One of the things that happened was that as the teachers, historians, and cultural warriors of the 1930s who were writing for the Federal Writers Project went into the South and found these individuals, these former Black people, these people who had been former slaves, they started interviewing them and literally putting their stories down on paper. Or as I mentioned to you all last week, in the case of Fountain Hughes, when they found him in Baltimore in 1949, they interviewed them and they got their stories. And many of them spoke about what life had been like, particularly when it came to Christianity and church services and the Black church. For example, Harriet Gresham, born a slave in 1838 in South Carolina, reported to her interviewer the following: a Negro preacher delivered sermons on the plantation, services being held in the church used by whites after the services on Sunday. The preacher must always act as a peacemaker and mouthpiece for the master, so they were told to be subservient to their masters in order to enter the kingdom of God. But the slaves held secret meetings and had praying grounds where they met a few at a time to pray for better things. Now, Miss Harriet Gresham, she had been denied education. She had been denied the seminary education that people at Western value so much. maybe not the most literate individual, but what we get from her analysis here, from her telling her story, is that a Negro preacher delivered sermons on the plantation under the supervision of a watchful white eye. And then after hearing that sermon, Black folks snuck off and had their own service under their own conditions, according to their own rules, in an area that left them feeling comfortable. Then there was this by William Ward, born a slave in the early 1830s in Georgia, as reported by his interviewer. On Sundays, the slaves were permitted to have a religious meeting of their own. This usually took place in the backyard or in a building dedicated for this purpose. They sang spirituals which gave vent to their true feelings. Again, we don't want to just gloss over that. Slaves had a separate meeting. In this case, they're allowed to have a separate meeting. And they sang spirituals which gave vent to their true feelings. We can interpolate from that Black people had to have what W.B. Du Bois would later on call in 1903 in The Souls of Black Folk, a double consciousness. There was the face they presented to the larger society, then the one that they had to keep to themselves for their private purposes for each other. There was one person who did the preaching. Her sermon was always built according to the master's instructions, which were that slaves must always remember that they belonged to their masters and were intended to lead a life of loyal servitude. None of the slaves believed this, although they pretended to believe because of the presence of the white overseer. If this overseer was absent sometimes and the preacher varied in the text of the sermon, that is, if he preached exactly what he thought and felt, he was given a sound whipping. Now, with this being the case, here's a situation that Mr. Ward's talking about. Black folks would be allowed to have a church service. They would sing spirituals that would express their true feelings through song. And in many cases, this would be a secret hiding in plain sight. And the Black people in the service, hearing this, would nod and smile and agree with it, all the while pretending, reserving for themselves a piece of their consciousness, a piece of their own awareness, a piece of their own understanding, that it was literally, as my father would say, going in one ear and out the other. They retained that which was of use for them. And why was that? Because as Mr. Ward pointed out, if the preacher varied from the preferred text of what he was supposed to be talking about, that is, that using this text of scripture, the New Testament, the word of God, the liberating word of Jesus, that was being used to tell them that they were supposed to lead a life of loyal servitude, the penalty for that was a sound whipping. Reverend Silas Jackson, born a slave in 1846 or 1847 in Virginia, as transcribed by his interviewer in 1937. Reverend Jackson said the following: Tom Ashby's plantation owner, father, went to one of the cabins late at night. The slaves were having a secret prayer meeting. He heard one slave ask God to change the heart of his master and deliver him from slavery so that he may enjoy freedom. Before the next day, the man disappeared. When old man Ashby died, just before he died, he told the white Baptist minister that he had killed Zeke for praying and that he was going to hell. So on this guy's deathbed, apparently, I guess his conscience finally caught up with him, and he's worried about spending his afterlife for killing a man who simply said he just wanted to be free. And then there was the case of Dennis Sims. Born a slave in Maryland in 1841, as transcribed by his interviewer in 1937. Now, scholars of HASP, let me put a fine point on this. If Dennis Sims was born in 1841, that means that by the time 1900 came, he was 59 years old. This man had lived 5+ decades and had seen so much by 1900. 1841, this is before the Mexican and American War. This is before the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming, California are even in the Union. This is before secession. This is before Fort Sumter. This is he lives during the time of Antietam, Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, all these things. He lives through Reconstruction. He lives through the founding of the Ku Klux Klan in 1866. He sees the North get tired of the whole enterprise, the whole freedom enterprise, and go off to do other things around the world. And he sees the rise of Jim Crow. In 59 years, that's what he sees by 1900. And now it's 1937. By 1937, Black people in America are being lynched to the tune of about 144 a year. By 1937, the NAACP is about 22 years old. By 1937, Ida B. Wells has been waging an anti-lynching campaign, a one-woman crusade for a number of years. That man has seen a lot. So when people come around and start asking him in 1937, what can you tell us about your life as a slave? He said, sometimes we would, unbeknownst to our master, assemble in a cabin and sing songs and spirituals. Our favorite spirituals were Bring It In the Sheaves, The Stars Am Shining for Us All, Hear the Angels Calling, and The Devil Has No Place Here. Listen to the title of those songs. Bring It In the Sheaves, The Stars Am Shining for Us All, Hear the Angels Calling, The Devil Has No Place Here. The singing was usually to the accompaniment of a Jew's harp and a fiddle or a banjo. We see in this description by Mr. Dennis Sims a different kind of worship, a kind of worship that is looking not just eschatologically at the world or the kingdom that God is going to make, but one which is calling the kingdom of God into existence. As many Black theologians have said, God wasn't just a God of the eschatology or the eschaton, what's going to happen, here and now and then beyond, but God was a God of history, a God who invaded history in the moment of time to rescue people here and now. Hear the angels calling. This is a God who's in constant communication with these people, not just on Sunday, but right now in the midst of their pain and their suffering. There's a certain theology going on there. All of those memories from those people that lived during the 19th century, who were interviewed in 1936, 37, 1935, 36, 37, their memories rested upon a foundation of that which happened in the 19th century. As has happened so often, and while those stories and those recollections are captivating, they're gripping, they are certainly giving us a lot of insight into what life was like for these people living, and not just in bondage, because bondage is one thing, that's hard enough. They're living in tyranny, in the tyranny of that bondage. Frederick Douglass proved to be one of the most articulate spokespersons of the reality of what the collective experience of those people were putting them through. He said, my master found religious sanction, that is, my master found or used religion for his cruelty. I have seen him tie up a lame young woman and whip her with a heavy cowskin upon her naked shoulders, causing the warm red blood to drip. And in justification of the bloody deed, he would quote this passage of scripture. He that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes. Mr. Douglass went on to say, regarding a person named Reverend Rigby Hopkins, Mr. Hopkins could always find some excuse for whipping a slave. It would astonish one unaccustomed to a slaveholding life, where those who are new or fresh or naive about slavery would be astonished to see with what wonderful ease a slaveholder can find things of which to make occasion to whip a slave. Slaveholders could whip a slave for anything, a mere look, word, or motion, a mistake, accident, or want of power, are all matters for which a slave may be whipped at any time. Does a slave look dissatisfied? It is said he has the devil in him, and it must be whipped out. Does he speak loudly when spoken to by his master? Then he is getting high-minded. It should be taken down a buttonhole. Does he forget to pull off his hat at the approach of a white person? Then he is wanting in reverence. In other words, he's not being deferential enough. It should be whipped for it. Does he ever venture to vindicate his conduct when censured for it? Then he is guilty of impudence. In other words, if a slave is accused of something, if he tries to defend himself, the act of merely trying to defend himself or someone else is a cause for whipping. He's guilty of being impudent. One of the greatest crimes of which a slave can be guilty, that is impudence. If you remember the original series of Roots back in the 1970s, there's a scene where Louis Gossett Jr., playing the role of Fiddler, tries to go to the master, played by Lauren Green. For those of us who remember the series Bonanza, Lauren Green playing the slave master. And Louis Gossett, playing the role of Fiddler, is trying to plead the case of Kunta Kinte. And he says, Master, he says, Master, you just have to understand. And Lauren Green's not hearing him. He says, but Master, no, you just got to understand. And Lauren Green says, watch your tone, Fiddler. Watch your tone. So here this guy is trying to plead for the case of this young guy, and he's about to be risked getting corporal punishment because of the tone of his voice. It is the constant force and reminder that the slave was to be subservient, to inhabit the role of an adult child. Douglas went on to say, does he ever venture to suggest a different mode of doing things from that pointed out by his master? He is indeed presumptuous in getting above himself, and nothing less than a flogging will do for him if the slave ever had an idea of his own. Does a slave while plowing break a plow, or while hoeing break a hoe? It is owing to his carelessness, and for it a slave must always be whipped. Mr. Reverend Rigby Hopkins could always find something of this sort to justify the use of the lash, and he seldom failed to embrace such opportunities. Now watch this. Frederick Douglass concludes this part of his narrative by saying, there was not a man in the whole county with whom the slaves would have preferred to not live with than Reverend Hopkins. And yet there was not a man anywhere around who made higher professions of religion, or was more active in revivals, more attentive to the class, love feasts, prayer and preaching meetings, or more devotional to his family, that prayed earlier, later, louder, and longer than the same Reverend slave driver, Rigby Hopkins. Look, the mere fact that this guy was a reverend anything and owned slaves is worth a session all by itself. But just as Frederick Douglass said, he hid behind the robes of God to justify his acts of cruelty. God had nothing to do with this. This is nothing more than just human proclivity, human greed. And it goes back to something we talked about earlier. I won't read this whole thing, but it's the part of Frederick Douglass's narrative where he said he has nothing to do with American Christianity. He draws a hard distinction between the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of America. America has Christianity as far as this man is concerned, Frederick Douglass, but the Christianity of America may as well be in a completely different universe than the Christianity of Christ. And I must tell you all that I never cease to be astonished every time I read his narrative to come across this part, because I just can't imagine each time what could be worse than being a Black person than being a slave in the 19th century. Frederick Douglass answers that for us. Were I to be again reduced to the chains of slavery, next to that enslavement, I should regard being the slave of a religious master the greatest calamity that could befall me. It turns out there was one thing worse than just being a slave, being the slave of a religious master. So what Black people wanted, what the Black church gave, with no area of life, of a Black person's life, that was free from intrusion, free from being observed, free from being scrutinized, free from the possibility of being whipped or beaten, as Frederick Douglass so eloquently laid out for us. There's no area of life in the 19th century where Black people are free from the watchful eyes of their presumed owners. So when it came to matters of faith, the one area inside themselves in their minds, and trust when I say that slave owners did as much as they could to penetrate that area as well, to invade that territory as well, but there comes a point where human limitation is exactly what it says, human limitation. So just as we note here, autonomy, some kind of independence. Black people carved out spaces of autonomy where they could. And the church, what some people call the invisible church on plantations, or the independent church movement in the North, those small spaces where they had for themselves, where they could do for themselves and dictate for themselves and call their own shots and worship in their own way and interpret God as they understood God to be the God of justice, of mercy, and second chances and forgiveness and power, who had the power to liberate and take the foot of the oppressor off their neck. That God was a God that they could not worship with their white brothers and sisters who A, didn't think them human, or B, wanted to enslave them, or C, wanted to deport them. But it still was the God they knew, who was the true God, who would work for them, just as he had worked for the children of Israel. So autonomy was an important issue for Black Christians. Independence for interracial fellowship in the church was predicated upon, watch it, worshiping together with their white brothers and sisters, first demanded that they be subordinate and that Black rights and Black interests would always be a secondary matter. In other words, they would have to agree to worship as being something other than first-class citizens or have their humanity humiliated on a regular basis. And they simply decided that economically, they can't do anything about their situation. Politically, they have no identity. Culturally, they're despised. But in the matter of faith, they can control that. And so where they could, they did. We have seen, for example, and there were examples of this, for example, in 1788, there was the establishment of the first African Baptist Church of Savannah. We talked about how Richard Allen and Absalom Jones in 1787, when Absalom Jones was pulled off his knees in church in Philadelphia one morning and told to stop praying or they would be removed by force. In that instant, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones walked out of that church and established their own church. And it eventually became the Bethel United Methodist Episcopal Church, or it became the first of what's named today as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So throughout American history, there was the constant battle between truth and lies. A different battle between truth and lies. We're in a battle between truth and lies today. But in the 19th century, the battle between truth and lies essentially came down to whether or not people would believe the word of God, the truth for what it said about all people, or the preferred lie that it was saying that they interpreted to mean for the institutionalization, perpetuation, protection, and deepening entrenchment of slavery. Now, I've mentioned in prior sessions this guy right here, Dr. William H. Myers. Dr. William H. Myers is an outstanding theologian, outstanding scholar. I believe he's still teaching at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio. And I want to play for you a portion of a presentation he made a number of years ago. I was so glad that I attended this thing because the brilliance of his exposition, well, you know what? You'll hear for itself. So Dr. William Myers, based upon the presentation he made about African-American interpretation of the Bible.
A common sermon slaves were subjected to time and time again was, you slaves will go to heaven if you are good. But don't ever think that you will be close to your mistress and master. No, no. There'll be a wall between you. But there'll be holes in that wall that will permit you to look out and see your mistress when she passes by. If you want to sit behind this wall, you must do the language of the text. Obey your master. A 19th century Black woman, Fannie Barrier Williams, summarizes well the reason for use of Christianity in this manner. She says, religion, like every other force in America, was first used as an instrument and servant of slavery. All attempts to Christianize the Negro were limited by the important fact that he was property of valuable and peculiar sort, and that the property value must not be disturbed, even if his soul were lost. If Christianity could make the Negro docile, domestic, and less an independent and fighting savage, let it be preached to that extent and no further. How, under the midst of all of this, did our foreparents hold up? How did they confront a Bible that was supposed to free them, and yet being told every day that it was for enslaving them? It is from them, I think, that we can learn our greatest lesson of what we today need to do. They confronted this distorted biblical interpretation when they didn't even know the language of the land. And most of them couldn't read because the laws forbade them to be taught. Part of the answer lies in their ability to be post-critical in their biblical interpretation. That is, they reinterpreted everything that they were being told. For example, they said, our masters and our masters' families were Bible Christians, and we don't want to be like them. They said that the commandment, don't steal, does not apply to us since we are stolen property. Better yet, as one slave went into some deep theology and deep exegetical work, he said, it's not stealing. It's a matter of the worker's right to the fruits of his labor. When asked how, they asked, how could the white church take up cases about adultery when the deacon, the white deacon of the church, was the very master that had sold away the wife from the husband, never to return? Was it adultery then for them to take up with another while their former spouses were still alive? What gave, they asked, the white church the right to even judge on this matter, since they upheld the master's right to sell her in the first place? I tell you, it was involved in some deep interpretation. This ability to do critical thinking about what they were being told is captured very well by Howard Thurman's grandmother when she says, during the days of slavery, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. Always the white minister used as his text something from Paul. Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters, as unto Christ. Then he would go on to show how if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us. I promised my maker that if I ever learned to read and if freedom ever came, I wouldn't read that part of the Bible. The fact that the slaves knew that something was rotten in Denmark about this kind of biblical interpretation being heaped upon them by their oppressor is captured in a rather humorous way by a slave named George. George was informed by his master that he was to be buried in a good coffin and placed beside his master's earthly remains in the same vault with the white folks. George's response to this news was mixed. I like to have a good coffin when I die, but I'm afraid, master, when the devil come to take your body, he make a mistake and get mine. It should then be self-evident that our foreparents were critical thinkers, even without the education that we possess and the seminary training that we cherish. They did not swallow any kind of biblical interpretation just because somebody was quoting the Bible. Why didn't they? What was the foundation and framework of their critical thinking?
Hold on, we'll get back.
Jesus. In this sermon, Sojourner Truth recounts the events and struggles of her life from the time her parents were brought from Africa and sold up and down and hither and yon, to the time that she met Jesus within the context of her struggles for dignity of Black people and Black women. Her encounter with Jesus brought such joy that she became overwhelmed with love and praise. Praise, praise, praise to the Lord, she said. And I begun to feel such a love in my soul as I never felt before. Love to all creatures. And then all of a sudden it stopped. And I said, there's the white folks that has abused you and beat you and abused you people. Think on them. But then there came another rush of love through my soul, and I cried out loud, Lord, I can love even the white folks. Herein lies two of the answers to how our foreparents confronted distorted biblical interpretation. Appeal to their own experience with Jesus and control of their minds. The slave master may have controlled their bodies. They may have controlled what they were taught. There were two things that they could never control without the assent of the slave: their mind and their experience with Jesus. And our foreparents refused to yield either one to the oppressor. Teach me all the distorted biblical interpretation that you want. And even if I nod my head in a manner that appears to be agreement, you don't know what's going on in my mind. In my mind, I'm doing a little reinterpretation in light of my own experience with this same Jesus of whom you speak. For you see, I know a little something about it. All of it didn't come from books. It didn't all come from the words of others. It didn't all come from the Bible. But somewhere between the cotton rolls on a hot summer's evening, I had an encounter, and I wish you could have been there. Sojourner's understanding of Christianity is located primarily in her encounter with Jesus, her experience, if you would. Something that no one else could dictate and no one else could control. This allows her to transcend distorted interpretation by appealing to a higher source than the written source that she could not read and that so-called white Christians control.
In that brief segment, what Dr. Myers is saying is that with no other avenues available to them, with no ability to control their lives for the most part, Black people reserved for themselves the one part that they could control: their thoughts and their feelings, which included taking the liberty of reinterpreting the scripture that was being perverted in their hearing and reinterpreting it for themselves, not into something that they preferred, but to the truth that they were being led to understand, truly lay within and behind the words of the Bible, the distorted scripture that they were being fed. The devil's bargain that America made with this type of perverted preaching had far-reaching effects. As the nation grew from 13 colonies to a new early republic, And then with the Northwest Territory that was eventually divided into the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. As America grew and doubled in size, slavery spread further west. And every time, no matter what was going on, as the nation grew and people moved further and further west, the devil's bargain grew stronger. It became more entrenched. It became more costly. And a crisis was building. At some point, a crisis either on the human side of things or in the cosmic realm was bound to happen or going to happen, because conditions became more and more precarious as the nation continued to grow and slavery spread further west. And as new states were added and new controversies arose and the Underground Railroad was established. And by the time you get to the 1840s, that decade where we'll fight the Mexican-American War, that will double the size of the country one more time, giving us all the land mass that will inhabit or incorporate all the lower 48. The devil's handshake, the devil's bargain was still weighing down upon the reality and soul of this nation, until finally a rupture that had been developing all along, and finally the rupture became a chasm that eventually evolved into a cataclysm. When it came to slavery, there were Christians who thought, of course, that slavery was a good thing, that the Bible justified it, and they could, and I'm not kidding when I tell you all that they would literally read scripture, and for them, scripture was justifying it, endorsing it, in fact, demanding it. So from that standpoint, God was totally all right with it. And they would go so far as to say, listen, in the Old Testament prophets lived at a time, these spokespeople of God, when slavery was in existence, they did not condemn it. So if it must have been okay then, why wouldn't it be okay now? On the other hand, there were also Christians who would read those same scriptures and say, yes, it may have been a reality for the Old Testament, but even in the Old Testament, there were scriptures about how to treat slaves, and meaning human beings. But the New Testament was supposed to be that phase of God's enterprise with humankind, where slavery of the spirit, slavery of the body, slavery of the mind, slavery of humanity was supposed to be a thing of the past because of the work done on the cross. In our own time, we have seen how polarizing divisions and arguments over politics can be, and religion. And when the two are mixed, it becomes polarizing indeed. So in the 19th century, what was it? Was God for slavery? Was he against it? Well, it's easy enough to generically figure out where Black people would fall on this side of the argument. God would be against slavery. God will be a God of liberation. God will be a God of the Exodus. God will be a God who's the liberator of the Hebrew people. The cancer of the devil's bargain that America made well before the nation even fought the American Revolution. This began to bear some very, very tainted, poisonous fruit in the 1830s and 1840s. In 1838, the Presbyterian denomination split over what? Slavery. In 1844, the Methodist Episcopalians split over what? Slavery. In 1845, the Baptists split over slavery. The Baptists, I grew up as a Southern Baptist, they have difficulty agreeing upon issues of race today. Even in the 1840s, the Quakers were generally against slavery, but not all. So there was even division among Quakers. The interesting thing about the 1840s is this. The 1830s and 1840s are generally known, and especially the 1840s, it's known by US historians as that decade of the reform movements. Now, William Lloyd Garrison, the nation's most recognized abolitionist voice before Frederick Douglass, in 1831, he published his first edition of the Liberator newspaper, in which, I'm paraphrasing here, we said, I will be heard and I will not be ignored. He declared war on slavery. His whole technique was to try and use moral suasion to persuade people of the moral abhorrence of slavery. That's 1831. By the time you get to 1840, the year or the decade of the reforms, we're talking about reform movements like prison reform, education reform, for insane asylums, women fighting for the right to vote. All these reform movements in the United States, it is a decade of cultural revolution because women are fighting for the right to vote. You're trying to reform penitentiaries. It's a decade where human concerns are put on the forefront of people's minds. And of course, slavery becomes a big issue of reform called abolition. And it's in that same decade where there's so many reform movements where people now can't avoid talking about it. And of course, denominations get involved and it causes splits within the church. By the time you get to 1849, after the Mexican-American War, the devil's bargain begins claiming more and more of America's attention, more of America's time, more and more of America's political capital. So that on the eve of the Civil War, in 1859, 1860, by 1860, you have a rapidly expanding United States, a young, powerful, energetic nation that has a noose around its own neck called slavery. And by 1861, certainly by the end of 1861, or as indicated here, February 4th, 1861 to February 28th, 1861, by the time you get to February 1861, the South, the 11 Southern states that will form the Confederate States of America will have seceded. And the Civil War begins on April 12th, 1861. The battle between the evil of slavery and whether or not the nation would follow the words and guidance of Christ got to a point where there was no time left. People for decades had debated the rightness or the wrongness of it. Did God love slavery? Did God hate slavery? Was America going to make a right choice, a wrong choice? And by the advent of the Civil War, as many people had begun to bury Pharaoh and have second thoughts about this thing called slavery, all of a sudden Pharaoh raised himself one more time at the start of the Civil War. And it puts one in mind of when in Exodus 5:1, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, said, "Who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go? Who is this guy, your God, not even my God, that I should let my slaves go? I do not know this Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Listen, I'm a king. I don't know your God. These are my people. They were for me. Why should I listen to you? Well, that has some pretty contemporaneous overtones when you think about that, just the assumptions that he's making. Because the words of Pharaoh were foreshadowing of future evils, not just the Civil War. Obviously they were, but the words of Pharaoh, his assumption that he was the all-dominant voice and had the right and was entitled to own human beings all their lives. The fact that he could come up against a force that claimed to be bigger than him, and actually was, and he dismissed it without too much thinking. That foreshadowed similar personalities in the future. Futures like Benito Mussolini, the arrogance of it all. In Pharaoh's response, we see the bigotry of George Wallace. In Pharaoh's response, we see the tyrannical nature of Idi Amin Dada, the former bloodthirsty dictator of Uganda. In Pharaoh's response, we see the mindset of world destroyers like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong. Pharaoh was an early manifestation of the kind of personalities and the kind of mindsets and the kind of human dysfunction that we live with in the 20th and 21st century. The bigotry of Wallace, the arrogance of Mussolini, the tyrannical, murdering nature of Idi Amin, motivated by the evil that drove these men to do what they did. Likewise, the same thing with the world destroyers, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. But just like in their case, as in the case of Pharaoh, there was a cure for world destroyers and arrogant leaders and bigots and tyrants. Because as Pharaoh, American pharaohs were assuming for themselves the right to own and sell and do with people as they want. Just as in the case of the Hebrews, there was a God who sat high and looked low and took measure of what was going on, and finally decided to take action and providing us a foreshadowing of future power, grace, mercy, and justice. And in response to Pharaoh, who said, who is this God? I don't know him. I won't let your people go. God tells him later on in Exodus 8:1, let my people go. In no uncertain terms, let my people go. Let my people go so that they may worship me. You'll see here that God is not absolutely worried at all that Pharaoh says, I don't know your God. These are my people. God's like, look, it's okay you don't know me. I know you. And I'm going to set you, the first thing I need to set you straight on is, these are my people. And you can let them go the easy way or let them go the hard way, but you are going to let them go. And that same belief in how God reached down and declared that enough was enough, that fiery hand of liberation that Black people had prayed for, that would take action. The difference between Black theology during the 19th century and in many respects Black theology today is that Black theology sees God as not being the mysterious being who comes to save our souls. Yes, he does that. But this is a God who will reach down into time right now in a material way and make things happen, not in an ephemeral kind of ether sort of sense, but as in material, hard reality, making things happen, bending people's wills to his justice, to include a nation that purports to be a beacon of freedom, liberty, and opportunity. He will take that nation and make it do the right thing. And if it has to be through civil war, then that is the instrument, the medium through which it happened. 4 years of bloody civil war. Pharaoh sought to have his day. But just as Pharaoh sought to have his day, God would have his as well. By the time it was over with, the Civil War would claim close to 1 million lives. Those people who were born in the 19th century, who lived through this conflagration, and would go on to share their stories and their recollections of how their faith had brought them through. The church, those who were in the independent church movement in the North, those who had the privilege and the benefit of worshiping indoors in a building like Bethel AME, that Richard Allen and Absalom Jones established, and then the different congregations in Baltimore, other parts of Maryland, and then even down south. And then the invisible church on the plantations where Black people had to sneak away. And as Dr. Meyer told us in his presentation, even as they sat up under the words of a Black minister being watched by the white overseer, or as a white minister gave them distorted scripture, inside their minds, they were hearing for themselves the truth of what was not being said, and singing for themselves, and doing for themselves, and reinterpreting for themselves. Denied education, but not unintelligent. Denied access, but not completely impotent. Unable to do anything politically, legally, economically, but inside the interior spaces of who they were and understanding who they were, who God was to them, and this same Jesus who had come down from heaven to die for them. Someone that would do that for them would surely have a hand in liberating them. Pharaoh rose up to try and have his way, and Pharaoh was struck down. When we meet again, I want to take a look at the role of the Black church during the Civil War, and then after emancipation and during Reconstruction, how that foundation of the Black church, helped to shepherd Black people into the 20th century, because as Black folks quickly found out after 1865, freedom came. It was a good thing, of course. The 13th Amendment was passed, ending slavery, the 14th Amendment that dealt with civil rights, the 15th Amendment that dealt with slavery, but rather than dealt with voting, but sadly only for Black men, not women. Even with those constitutional amendments, what they call the Reconstruction Amendments, as the dust settled and the smoke cleared, Southerners and Northerners were already growing tired of the whole poor Black folks enterprise. Southerners were absolutely enraged at what they had lost and bewildered and further enraged by the fact that Black people dared to consider themselves not only free, but equal. Something had to be done to rebalance those scales. So during Reconstruction, there will be a movement of people called reformers. Reformers, in other words, the end of the Civil War and emancipation brought a cataclysm to Southern life. It perverted things, it distorted things, it put things out of balance. So these reformers, their idea of reform was to put things back to the way they were. The reformers are what they call redeemers. During Reconstruction, they were called redeemers. We want to redeem what has been lost, to reestablish it. The redeemers were on a mission to make sure that Black subjection, Black second-class citizenship was reinstitutionalized in a new form, but second-class citizenship to be sure. And in that whole process, while all that was going on, with domestic terror organizations like the Ku Klux Klan to give them the kind of murderous punch they needed to make their vision become a reality, the Black church will come along one more time to provide an avenue and a vehicle for Black people to fight back, to set up social institutions, and working with the Freedmen's Bureau first, and then on their own, left with no choice but themselves, to provide the community organizing, the schools, the marriages, the economic support that would be foundational for the Black community surviving the 19th century and getting off to a somewhat reasonable start in the 20th century. I'll take your questions now.
Okay, I just have one comment so far, and then you guys can start typing them in or unmute yourselves. But Paul just mentioned that the March 2021 Atlantic Magazine has an extensive article about the WPA project. We mourn for all we do not know. Just wanted to share that.
Thanks.
Other than that, nothing's come into the chat. So please feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment or type it in. Here we go. Okay. Question, were a significant number of slaves non-Christians or not religious at all?
I don't have a definitive response to it relative to how many there were. I think that there are many people, just like today, who were definitely believers. There are many people even today that question, did Frederick Douglass have, he was so hard on religion, did he believe? And it turned out that Frederick Douglass was an official in the AME church. So the generic answer is a yes, there were a good number of people who were of faith, but at the same time, there are a good number of people who were not, because just like people ask today, how could a loving God, an all-powerful God, allow this to go on? So the cognitive dissonance of that reality, people not being able to wrap their mind around that, left some hesitant, some disbelieving, but certainly the Black community has become generally, not completely accurate, but generally identified as being a community in the nation that has a strong faith tradition.
How much of African-American religion was kept alive? What they had before they were slaves?
Well, good question, John. What happens is that you find, for example, down in, let's take the example of Cuba for a moment. In Cuba, where you have a heavy Catholic influence, you have traditions of African religious worship, which are not necessarily Islamic, but the more animistic kind of worship of the sky and objects and so on that blended with Catholic Christianity and produced its own kind of religious offshoot called Sanria. All right, so that's what happened in the Caribbean, in Cuba, for example. Now, some places like South Carolina, and I think what they call the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands, in that instance of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the Black Belt, meaning it was that part where even today there's a density of Black population in those areas. And in the 18th, 19th century, demographers have gone back and looked at that. In some parts of South Carolina, the Black to white ratio was sometimes 15-1. And in those cases where Black people outnumber white people so overwhelmingly, African traditions, African religions survived, predictably, a lot more intact. So they're in the United States. They're obviously not in Africa. So they're taking the elements that they remember their religion from the continent, and sometimes they're blended with Christianity. So you have different kinds of Protestant and African worship. Just like, again, to cite the people of the Sea Islands, some of you have probably heard of this thing called the Gullah language, G-U-L-L-A-H. Well, it's a form of African dialect, English, and sometimes Spanish, that's merged into its own dialect. And if you're not from the area, obviously, it's very difficult trying to figure out what it is. So we use that analogously to figure out if that's what happened linguistically. The same thing happened religiously. And as one of you asked in an earlier session, when it came to domestic slavery, and this would be primarily in the North, where you would find Black people in New England or in places like New York or Philadelphia that are house servants or footmen or carriage drivers, where you have maybe 1 or 2 Black people in an entire household. Where they're more isolated, their African language, tradition, culture, religion gets further and further away from them. And they adopt the belief systems of those claiming to own them. So it really depended upon where you were in the South, where you were in the North, and your situation of ownership. If there were a lot of you or a small number of you. You take the case of Sojourner Truth, she converted to Christianity, but for a good part of her life, she spoke Dutch. That's because she was in New York City. So she didn't have the benefit of being around other Africans in large numbers to give her that kind of cultural footing that would have left more of an African kind of imprint on what she did. So when she spoke of, like Dr. Myers was saying in the presentation, when she spoke of praise to the Lord, she's doing the more Methodist kind of itinerant preacher exposition of how she knew and understood God to be.
Fred, I think it's interesting, and I know for all the right reasons you focused on the Black church for this course, but I think it would also be interesting to look at, and you mentioned early in your presentation about cultural issues. And if you look at what else is happening in society during this period, especially post Civil War, in terms of the development of social and cultural organizations, with many of them having as their purpose is to improve community, things like Grange and Ruritans. And then much later, you start looking at things like Rotary, but all the service organizations that are about improving the quality of life and for humanity. And they have spiritual underpinnings to them. But again, you're looking at Black people that are not allowed to participate and be a part of these organizations because it's outside of their circles. And that persisted well into the 20th century.
That's right. That's right. And what happened, just as I do have to look, I guess it's a good suggestion. I need to look at things like Grange and Rotarians. But if you look at, where Black people and white people might have cooperated, you find, for example, what was it called? Tom Watson, who was a Southerner. And there was a movement of an agrarian movement in the South in the late 19th into the early 20th, where you had Black Southerners and white Southerners, both of whom were poor. Oftentimes they're both inhabiting the area called sharecropping. And white landowners saw that as they began organizing into this block of poor Black people, poor white people, rich landowners saw that as being a threat to their economic interests. So in addition to the fact that these organizations you mentioned are outside of the social circles that Black people normally inhabited, whenever there was any kind of cooperation, between Black Southerners and white Southerners, so often the elites would come along and, just to be blunt about it, would say, look, you know that if you sit up and work with these people and they end up getting this kind of right or getting this kind of power economically, the next thing they'll be doing is want to live next to you and date your daughter. Well, that they weren't going to ever allow that. So they always used the wedge and cudgel of race to break apart these alliances and keep people disparate enough so they can hang on to power. So these reform organizations, most of which I'm concerned, or rather are familiar with, coming out of the Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865. So many of those were doing an early version of what you're talking about. The Freedmen's Bureau was a tremendously wonderful social movement, but there were constitutional issues about it. Like, did the Constitution allow for a reform agency to exist inside of the War Department? And if it did, what about the Freedmen's Courts, the Freedmen's Banks? The Constitution doesn't say anything about that. And they were attacked over and over and over again. The Freedmen's Schools, is that a separate institution? So, you know, you entered into this period, you mentioned all the ones you're talking about today, we call those nonprofits, I believe. There were those kind of charitable organizations that did take up the mantle and the torch for moving things ahead. But it was just such I'm just sometimes overwhelmed at the steep hill that people had to climb post-Civil War, because attitudes die so hard, even after so many people have literally died.
Well, there's still a hill to climb.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have found for you all, let me see if I can get this up.
If we lose a sense of
Not that.
our American history, we'll lose.
Fred, while you're looking for whatever, another comment came in, and I know you're working on a couple of writing projects, so maybe this is one, but Priscilla's asking if you've thought of writing a book on the Black church. And then she says, haha, in your free time.
The short answer is yes, I have. And this course has further crystallized that yes into a yes. Because there are people that have written books on the Black church and they've been very good. But like a lot of historians, I don't think that they have not taken the time to look into some of the areas that I think still need further exploration and to be brought to people's attention.
Fred, I know that you have a degree from Western Theological Seminary. Have you been able to teach about the Black church to people who are attending Western Seminary, for example?
Actually, Judy, yes, I did. You know, when we went full remote last summer, the seminary in Hope College, I was asked to teach an online course of the Black church. And that was about maybe, I think it was 6 or 8 weeks. So last summer I taught an online course for the seminary. And just about a month ago, I taught, the seminary has what they call small sessions, what they call Abby. So I did believe me, a very fast overview of the impact of race in America, not so much in the church, but in the Black church, but on the church in America. And so I've had opportunity to present this, and there have been occasions where the seminary has asked me to teach full semesters on this subject, African American history in the Black church. So yes, and I hope to do more of it. And I told one of the things I told the students in that online class, and also at the Abbey that I taught them back in February, I said, look, very often what happens, I see this with my students at Hope when I teach slavery and race in America. They tell me that the information I'm sharing with them, this is the first time they're getting this stuff. They say they had never heard this before. Now, when I first got here, I grew up in the Maryland, DC area. Not that we got so much of it, but I just couldn't imagine, how could you not get this? Well, I had to consider my audience, and I believe them. And now these are college students, they haven't gotten it either. And so I told the students during the class last summer, I said, listen, they get fired up, they learn about it, they're enraged, they're mad that no one's taught them about this. They can't believe the depth and breadth and the extent and the duration of the injustice, and on and on and on. And they want to go out and do something and fix that and do this and adjust this. And I tell them, look, as much as I enjoy your passion, as much as I enjoy your desire to want to go out and do something to make this right, I said, understand, we've been at this for over 300 years. There are people with a lot more intelligence and a lot more courage than I have or ever will have that have literally died trying to get this right, trying to get America's self-proclaimed vision of itself to become a reality. And then this, Judy, was the hardest part. I told them, I said, you are going to go out there into your worship, your ministry fields as ministers of word and sacrament. You guys you are seminary students working on your MDiv or your doctorate of ministry. And I'm telling you right now, you're going to go out to these various churches or ministries and mention this kind of stuff to people, and they simply will not care. They flat out just, this is not part of what they're hiring. And they'll tell you, I said, stand by for it. Somebody from the head of the deacons board is going to come to you one day and say, we didn't hire you to talk about this black stuff. We didn't hire you to talk about poverty or injustice. Your job is to preach the word of God and save people's souls, and that's it. Now, at that point, that's where you have to make a decision, because see, when you have, spouse and children to support and food and bills to pay, it's not abstract anymore. So I told them, this information may stir you up, but then we run up against the wall of reality about what are you going to do? Do you go on with your career? Do you risk what's going on? And so I told them, in a lot of ways, frankly, being a black person, it's easier for me to say this, because when my students see me coming, they go like, what do you expect? So I can come at this a lot harder. But for a white person in 2021 to say this, just like was James Word, the white kid that went down there and participated in the Freedom Rising in the 1960s, people will look at him and go, what dog do you have in that fight? And the answer is the dog of humanity as a human being. And I tell them, you got to be prepared for the pushback that comes at you on the basis of you being a white person. Why are you advocating for this? Men that advocate, to stop sexual harassment or sexual assault. What are you doing that for? Because it's the right thing to do. So we have these discussions at the seminary. They're tough, but they're necessary, and they're also very enriching. For those of you who are interested, there is an organization in the Grand Rapids area called the Colossians Forum. The Colossians Forum, and it's based on the book of Colossians. And their entire reason for existence is they take on the most difficult subjects that divide churches. Gay marriage, abortion, Black Lives Matter, all the things that's causing people to be at each other today. They are committed to finding a way of not trying to be on one side or the other, but having Christians talk about it in a way that they can still walk away, maybe disagreeing, but not hating each other. And they're located in Grand Rapids, and they do some really great work. I attended a workshop of theirs back in 2019, and it was really quite informative and pretty good.
Hey, Fred, I want to follow up on that just a little bit, and that is, I think that the white church can learn a lot from the Black Christian church. And I think that the white church has allowed itself to be taken over by the heresies of Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism. And that needs to be dealt with.
Well, were you familiar with the article that came out in the magazine Christian Century, when its editors wrote an editorial saying that the previous president was unfit, not qualified to be president? Well, that was the equivalent of a nuclear explosion going off in the world. And they also mentioned something, I think, that in that same discussion, there was talk of Christian nationalism, which again is different than Christianity, and it has a lot more to do with nationalism and not so much Christianity.
Professor Johnson, do you have any thoughts on, now that we're 160 years after the Civil War and still have a lot of problems in this country, accepting a lot of folks do Black people as equal, compared to the way the German people dealt with the Holocaust, and we're 80 years past that, and they seem in a lot better place, not perfect, but than we are, and we're 160 years past the end of legalized slavery. Do you have any thoughts on what an American character, or what the difference is? It seems like we have a hard time, admitting a mistake and moving forward, and to the credit of the German people, they have seemingly.
You know, let me look at this from two different responses from two different angles. First of all, you are absolutely right and show some great insight in looking at how the German people handle what happened after the Holocaust. They didn't try to deny it. Now, of course, there were Holocaust deniers, and there are Holocaust deniers today. But for the most part, the German people saw the facts, and there was no getting around the facts. Somehow, and I'll just say this. I spent most of my historical career being baffled by how a culture that was so enlightened, so intellectual, so educated could have even permitted the brief presence of a thug and murderer like Adolf Hitler. But I've come into a new understanding of the fragility of democracy, particularly when you have people that are intentionally trying to weaken the institutions of democracy. Demagogues can rise under the right conditions. And just like the saying says, all you need is enough good people doing nothing for the bad ones to rise to power. So the German people post-World War II did not evade the reality of what had happened. And then they also had this other thing called the Nuremberg war crime trials, where the entire world saw what happened. And the perpetrators were brought before the public, and there was absolutely no doubt. There's no doubt. I'll find this for Kim. There was a guy he's the last living lawyer and member of the prosecuting team at Nuremberg. He's in his 90s now, early 90s. And he tells a story, I think in one of this, a CBS documentary or something, where he says that even when they couldn't find witnesses to give verbal testimony at Nuremberg, this guy said, okay, I'll do you one better. The Germans kept records. So they had files and records and documentation. The documentation was more damning than the oral witness testimony. So they just couldn't get around it. So because of that, the German people had confronted it, and they had passed laws. You know, free speech, they love it, but you don't get to talk about Nazis or promote Nazism. You will be jailed in Germany for that. I don't know that would ever happen in America. The second thing, let me go to South Africa. I was told by Dr. Kevin Bales, who runs an organization called Free the Slaves. Dr. Bales came to my class, my foreign policy class, a number of years ago. And so I asked him about slavery, you know, American style, South African style, apartheid. And he said, the one thing that the people did in South Africa and he said, you know, we can only speculate now because we will never know. But the one thing that people thought was going to happen after apartheid was this big race war. That's what they always feared. But then the South Africans did something which he called brilliant. They had something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the South African government said, okay, there were people from the South African government that did some horrific things to Black people. And there were people from the African National Congress that Mr. Mandela had been part of or associated with, that, you know, the guerrillas or the people have been fighting for independence. So there was enough blood on both sides. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up so that people who had been perpetrators could come forth, say, here's what I did. I feel terrible about what I did. I realize now that I was the wrong thing to do, or I did it at the order of so-and-so. But they told them, if you do that, there will be no retribution. You will not be jailed. And it was basically weeks and months of just confession and testimonial. It turned out that saying I'm sorry carried a lot of mileage. And Dr. Bale said that if America had done that after the Civil War, its own type of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who knows what that could have done for us. But since we never did, some of the dysfunctions, some of the social pathologies that we were wrestling with back then were never explicated, never explored, never dealt with. And so here we are today, having the same argument or the same conversation over and over and over again. And look, you know what? Sometimes when I do these presentations, I can see it on people's faces. Like, oh my God, you know, here we go again. I thought, look, you think you're tired of it? You should try being me. I'm tired of it too.
Thanks.
I would like to speak about a book I just started reading for my Wisconsin Church Book Club. and I'll hold it up.
Okay.
Okay, so you can see it. It's called Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion by Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove.
Reconstructing the gospel. Wow. Okay.
Can you see that?
Yes.
It is so good. I just read one chapter and we'll be discussing it this month. And he has also written about white nationalism in the Christian century in one of the book reviews that he did. This book was not reviewed, but oh my goodness, it is so good.
I am going to thank you so much, Priscilla, for holding that up. I'm going to get that. I'm sending myself an email right now to remind myself of that. You know, I wanted to share with you all real briefly. I mentioned Fountain Hughes, the Fountain Hughes interview that was done in 1949 in Baltimore when they found him. Fountain Hughes at the time was 101 years old, which is just amazing to me. Which meant that he was born in 1848, the year after the Mexican-American War. And I think this is the right one.
My name is Fountain Hughes.
Fountain Hughes.
I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old. That's enough. What she made, I don't know. Just go ahead and talk away there. You don't mind, do you? Now, and now your husband and you both are young. You all try to live like young people ought to live. Don't want everything somebody else has got.
Wait.
What if I never made no bills in my life. And until I get the money to buy them. And else I do without it. Well, boys live quite different than the way they live now. But boys wasn't as mean as they are now either. Boys lived through. Boys are going with the lived all night anywhere. We had no home, you know. We just turned out like a lot of cattle. You know how they turn the cattle out in the pasture?
So right here, Fountain Hughes is saying that after slavery was ended, his owners just turned them out like cattle. They had nowhere to go. They were given no kind of support. It's like, okay, you know what? Slavery's over. Get off my land.
Well, after freedom, you know, colored people didn't have nothing. Colored people didn't have no beds when they're slaves. They would sleep on the floor. Tied him, tied down. Just like a lot of wild people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't like look at no book. There were some freeborn colored people where they had a little education, but there were very few of them where we was. And we all had a, what you call, I might call it now, jail sentence. It just seemed we were in jail. Now I couldn't go from here across the street, or I couldn't go from nobody's house without I have a note or something from my master. And if I had that pass, I was going to call a pass. If I had that pass, I could go wherever he sent me. And I'd have to be back. Whoever he sent me to, they'd give me another pass. And I'd bring that back so to show how long I'd been gone. We couldn't go out and stay an hour or 2 hours or something like that. They send you, now say for instance, I go to the Shirley's place, I'd have to walk. And I'd have to be back maybe in an hour, maybe they'd give me an hour, I don't know just how long I'd get it. But they'd give me a note so there wasn't nobody interfere with me, tell who I belonged to. And when I come back, I'd carry it to my master and give that to him. That'd be all right. But I couldn't just walk away like the people just now, you know. It was what they call, we were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows and hogs and all like that, have an auction bench. and they cut you on up on the bench and beat on you, the same as you beating on the cattle, you know.
Was that in Charlotte that you were a slave? Was that in Charlotte or Charlottesville?
That in Charlottesville.
Charlottesville,
They
Virginia.
sell women, sell men. Oh, they. And then if they had any bad ones, they'd sell them to the nigger traders, what they call the nigger traders. And they ship them down south to sell them down.
Listen to the casual nature of how Fountain Hughes just describes this reality. There was every day. He says, I had to, if I had to go to another neighboring plantation, I had to have a note. In South Africa, they had the pass cards. To leave out of the township, you had to have a pass card. In the South, you needed a note. If you did not have a note, you were said to be a runaway. You could be captured, hung, killed, brutalized for that. Then he says that you heard him talk about how they would go to auction and they bid on them like horses and cows. And then if you had bad ones, what would they do? They sell them down south to the nigger traders. Now, this is Fountain Hughes in 1949, and you heard how old he said he was, right? 115 years old in 1949. My question is, how do you live 115 days under those conditions, much less 115 years? I am such a punk compared to this guy. So I'm going to send this link to Kim, who will forward it to the rest of you. This is from the Fountain Hughes interview, which was conducted in 1949 in Baltimore, Maryland. At the time, he was 115 years old. His grandfather lived to be 101 years old. I think his grandfather was owned by Thomas Jefferson, so he said, and he gives you direct insight into what it was like, not must have been like, but what it was like to be a slave in Charlottesville, Virginia. And then immediately after the Civil War, when, as he said, they were turned out like horses and cows. And then he called them, he says, we live like wild people. Honestly, every time I feel like being lazy and I think about a guy like this, I had to get back into the game and keep on being busy. I am not going to go to heaven one day and run into Fountain Hughes and have him pointing at me saying, what did you do to make good on my sacrifice? I'm going to have a good answer for him.
Then we just have one more comment that came in, Fred, from Jean, that it's hard not to dismiss Christianity as meaningless, given what masters did to their slaves and former slaves, but it has somehow held power, even for the slaves.
Yes, and when I tell people right now, listen, I have a friend of mine right now. Marcia went into the hospital the other day for a standard checkup. By the time she left out, she realized she had been told she had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She is not going to be here. She will not make it to the summer. And she and I talked about this for a long time over the weekend. And, Marcia said to me the same thing that I tried to tell people myself, is that don't base your relationship with Christ on what other people do. People do all kinds of strange things with everything. We've seen what some people did with the Constitution on January 6th. When they stormed the Capitol, they thought they were doing it for democracy. Well, that's what they thought. Then there's the truth. So we need to be very clear that make sure that we're not allowing ourselves to be deduced, to be seduced, manipulated, or bamboozled by some perverted type of ideologies. Don't let your relationship with Christ be diminished by the fact that other people have used Christianity for the worst purposes imaginable. It does not add it for a second detract from the truth of the message, because human beings are too flawed to do it the right way.
Exactly.
Okay, sermon over.
Okay, it is 11:02. Does anyone else want to make a last quick question or comment? Otherwise, we will wrap it up.
I might have a quick question. I'm not sure. Fred, do you teach anything about spirituals to your students? Do a few classes about spirituals? For example, I'm thinking about follow the drinking gourd. That would mean something different to slaves than it would be to white people. Have you addressed the spirituals?
Kit, when I'm teaching this segment of the course in U.S. history, I do talk about spirituals, and Yeah, I teach about the short answer is yes, I teach about the spiritual. Spiritual is not in any great length. And when I first taught the class, in my early years teaching, I actually tried to sing some of the spirituals and half the students dropped the course. But yes, I do teach about the spiritual.
Kim and Dr. Johnson, I'd like to make a comment. Ori said I could speak for him. He doesn't usually, he doesn't share his stories much.
No.
His grandfather's parents were slaves, and his grandfather was his father figure down in Blackstone, Virginia.
Okay.
And he talks about, when you talk about survival, the grandfather had 40 acres. He doesn't know if he was part of that 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah.
Story, but he never went to school, taught himself to read, write what he could, and he would go to his tent camp meetings and for the celebration. But he talks about he had 13 children, 2 of his homes burned down that he rebuilt by hand. He would dig his own wells. And he would drop in these wooden forms, I think, into that well, and then you jump in and dig out a little more, and then you drop another one in, and you keep digging these wells. He grew tobacco, and Ori remembers he was an 8-year-old kid having to, no mask or anything, put arsenic on those tobacco plants. And you see Ori's on oxygen today, so I'm sure that had something to do with it. But the story, it's just fascinating, of the survival, and he lived to be 100. Was splitting his own wood in his 90s. The stamina is just amazing to me.
Oh my God, I can't believe Beverly, hearing that, I can't believe that I was actually complaining about shoveling my sidewalk a few weeks ago.
Right, work ethic, it's amazing.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you,
That's
Beth.
great.
Thank you,
That
Ori.
goes back,
Good to see you
that
both.
goes back to what we're talking about relative to the strength of these people and just their, and you know what, I don't want to emphasize somebody like, oh, these are strong people. We still, even with all that, they did all that, they still lived through some horrific circumstances. But the mere fact, those circumstances, the fact that his relatives were able to do all that under those conditions, it just makes me respect them all the more. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Good to see you both. Okay, another wonderful Wednesday morning with Dr. Fred Johnson. Thank you for being here, everyone. Let's give him a hand.
I just say that you guys look so good, so good.
You too. It's great to see you all. Enjoy the day, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Take care. See you next week.